This is House Planning Help, episode 56. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in high-quality buildings. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century. My personal goal is to create an energy-efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. Coming up in this episode, my guest is Piers Taylor from Invisib Studio Architects, and we're exploring which building systems are best when it comes to creating low-energy buildings. Before we get into that, I just wanted to say a quick thank you and a well done as well to everyone at Encraft. They put on their own Passive House conference in the last week, and I got along to that and found it really interesting. Helen and Samir did offer me the opportunity to stand up in front of the crowd and tell everyone about the Kickstarter documentary that we funded. So I certainly wasn't going to pass on that opportunity, and that was great. So thank you. That was brilliant to be able to explain more about the future of housing and how air tightness can help, which we hope to release this coming August. Very, very exciting. In this episode, my guest is Piers Taylor from the Invisib Studio Architects. You may know Piers if you're in the UK from the TV show The House That 100k Built. This is £100,000, and just showing that it's entirely possible to do it on this tight budget. If you're listening out in the States, that would be around about $170,000. A second season of that coming soon. Although today, Piers is helping me answer a question from Aaron Alex on building systems. However, I started by asking Piers how he got into architecture.
Okay, so I was a mature student when I studied architecture. I had parents that were interested in engineering, architecture, design, those sorts of things. My mother was a really progressive interior designer that was Australian that came to this country in the 50s and was amazed by the sea of beige. My father was a ship designer and was interested in mechanical objects. They always lived in really interesting houses. So really interesting houses that my mother would completely strip out and remodel in a kind of really unconventional way. So, but what's interesting is that I didn't know I wanted to be an architect until I was traveling in Australia. My first child had been conceived very young, and I suddenly realized I needed to go back to university and get my life together. I'd gone to art school as a kind of wayward late teen and realized, or was uncertain about what I wanted to do. So I'd gone to art school, founded sounds too grand, but set up a construction company and went traveling in Australia. My eldest child was conceived, realised I needed to go to university, enrolled in Sydney in graphic design, actually, strangely, and because the first term of a design in that design school in Sydney was a shared design school. So architecture, graphic design, interior design, industrial design all shared the same first semester. Now, what was interesting was that the first talk to this shared group of people from multidisciplinary subjects was an architect called Glenn Murcutt, who is an extraordinary figure, a charismatic architect who is passionately interested in the environment, landscape, the wider context of how you place buildings. And as soon as he opened his mouth, I realized I wanted to do architecture and went out of his lecture and re-enrolled in architecture. And he changed the course of my life with one talk. And that was 25 years ago or something. And
Going strong still. Well, we like to focus these episodes down. I know there are a few things, given the work that I've seen through your TV shows, that I'd like to talk about at the end. But first up, I have a question here from Aaron Alex. I'm going to read it out, and then maybe we can go through and address some of these elements. So he says, one really important topic I would like you to explore is the best building systems to achieve a Passive House standard. I would love to hear from an unbiased source. Is that you?
Yes, I'm unbiased, very much so.
Good, okay, unbiased source. The differences between SIPs, masonry, ICF, timber frame, etc. And perhaps give an idea as to which system makes best environment and economic sense to achieve Passive House standard, and also explore the insurance and mortgage feasibility of it at some point, as many mortgage companies are averse to the modern building methods. So that's quite a lot to take in. Maybe we can start on a basic level of what is a building system?
Okay, so there are lots of ways of constructing a building. I think of it actually in terms of lightweight or heavyweight, and within those camps there are various subsections of different ways of doing things. And let's widen this up a little bit and look at this issue to do with heavyweight construction and lightweight construction, and also on-site construction and off-site construction, because I think crudely most buildings fit into those categories. Dealing with houses, or let's deal with one-off individual houses, because one-off individual houses are very different from housing where you have a repeated unit and the economies of scale. All houses need to be constructed from something, and the question is what is most efficient, what is most economically sound, and what is best environmentally. And I instinctively think timber, because timber for me is a material I know, I'm used to it. It's, of course, has, sustainable credentials, it's a renewable material, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In this country, we have huge stocks of untapped, low-grade timber that's entirely suitable for construction. But what's good about timber is that it is very, very workable on site. And everybody knows how to work timber. Every builder, every carpenter, it's a readily available material that a lot of people know how to use. So it's an unskilled thing. People with a limited amount of skill and very ordinary skills can do it. And it's easier to get a good quality finish with a lightweight timber building. So, for 20 years, I've been sitting on the fence between heavyweight and lightweight construction. And I've done very lightweight buildings and regretted it. And then I've done heavyweight buildings. But now, I suppose my instinctive position is that lightweight buildings are easier to achieve quality. And quality in terms of how the building performs. So, let's assume we're talking about timber. Timber, if you make something off-site, is typically more expensive, because if you make something in a factory where you're paying for lights and heating, et cetera, and rent, all those sorts of things, it's more expensive than doing it on-site. So I was labouring under the misapprehension that it was better to always prefabricate things. It generally isn't. I still think that the simple fact of people making things by hand on-site is the most efficient way to do a building in this country if you're talking about a single building. And that is with sticks and stud work, effectively. The lowest common denominator of building systems is a stud frame. And I think that is still the most efficient way to do a single building in this country, because it's incredibly cheap, it's incredibly quick, it's incredibly widely available. You can do it on site, doesn't need any off-site construction, and anyone can do it. And my feeling then is that passive house construction depends on getting airtightness critically, and depends on workmanship. And with that system, you can get airtightness and the type of building that allows, the insulation to be, or minimal thermal bridges, et cetera, et cetera. That's my kind of simple response. Let's just talk a little bit then about why it's hard to achieve it with a masonry building. With a masonry building, you're dealing with block work and wet trades, and it's always been difficult and expensive to get a good quality finish with wet trades. They're the sort of materials that ground workers and block workers throw together very crudely because they assume someone else is going to finish those things. And I'd say proportionally, there are far, far fewer passive houses that are masonry than timber. However, masonry has huge advantages in terms of its thermal mass. So thermal mass is something, it's a heat store, and effectively you get radiators for free in a building that has thermal mass. So the only drawback with a lightweight building is that you don't have thermal mass. So there are hybrid buildings where you can have concrete floors or concrete ground floors, and then above that, lightweight timber construction that's super insulated and well sealed and taped.
It's quite interesting in Aaron's question how he was saying an unbiased approach and view of this. Is it worth going through each individually, or do you find yourself generally just using timber frame projects now because that's how you've settled through your experience?
Well, I think as you get older, you make decisions, in theory that are based on experience, and you develop an instinct for things. But I'm still, I'd say, unbiased. I don't use timber because it's timber. When I started out, I was suspicious of timber. In a way, suspicious because it came as a position of bias. It seemed like everyone who liked timber thought that you had to use it, and was really full of misinformation about things like concrete. Now, concrete is, for example, the world's most environmentally sound material in terms of...
Whoa. We've got to slow you down there, really? Sorry?
Yeah. Well, the problem with concrete is the amount of concrete that's used, not the raw material itself necessarily. Sure, there are all sorts of problems with its manufacture, and the lazy use of concrete. So let's just step back and look. If you substituted concrete for any other material in roads, in big span construction, in tall buildings, it would have a far greater carbon footprint. So if you use steel, for example, you would have a far greater carbon footprint than concrete. Concrete has its places. It makes fantastic foundations. It makes fantastic, cores to buildings. And it has its place. It isn't necessarily always a bad material. I think the problem with concrete is its ubiquitous and lazy use. So I would think at a stroke, you could halve the use of it. And then I would say quite quickly, you could get down to 75% to 25% of its current use. And I think if you took what's left for kind of key infrastructure projects, you'd have about 20% of the current use of concrete. And then we can start to explore things that could be different. And timber is the one thing that I haven't mentioned in this context, because of course it's difficult to build tall buildings in timber. But now we're getting up to kind of 8 stories, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So over time, timber technology will allow us to replace concrete. And sorry, when I say the most environmentally sound material, I mean in terms of big span commercial buildings and infrastructural projects. For houses, there's no need to use concrete, really, unless you desperately want the thermal mass in the floor, I would say. There's almost no reason to use concrete in a house.
So these build systems, how do we compare one to the other? What are the factors that are going to change between them as we look at them independently?
So assuming we're talking about houses, because that's the thrust of this, I think that in a way, houses are usually quite simple things in terms of their construction. They're usually one-off bespoke projects that aren't repeatable. And SIPS panels, you don't usually get the advantages of economies of scale, or again, in houses where you're dealing with conventional spans, usually even in an interesting building, you're dealing with spans that aren't vast. You're not dealing with a project that's three-dimensionally incredibly complex. SIPS panels are fantastic for some things, but in a building like a house, I struggle to see the real advantage of SIPS panels, because they're expensive, they contain all sorts of formaldehydes and glues, and they are made in a factory, and thus, people on site can't just put them up, and you're paying for the overheads of the factory and everything else. So,
but it must have a speed factor when we're talking SIPs on site.
Yes, it does. You're absolutely right. I mean, all timber frames are quick. What's interesting about timber frame as opposed to masonry is that it allows you to get your roof on very quickly. So, you can have your roof on in a matter of days in a lightweight construction. Block work, you're starting from the ground and you're working up, and then eventually you get around to putting the roof on. Timber frame, you can put the wall stud work up in a matter of days, get the roof stud work on, and get the roof on very, very quickly. Similarly with SIPS panels, the advantage of it, if you take cost out of the equation, it's hugely full of potential, and in terms of speed, in terms of saving time, because you make it in a factory, you come to site and you put it up and bang, your roof goes on. But actually, you could say making a timber frame in a factory would be just as quick, as SIPS panels. So SIPS panels aren't intrinsically better than timber frame for any type of construction other than what's good about SIPS panels is that you do away with beams effectively, because they are in themselves structurally, they have a structural capability. So for example, you can use an upstand of a wall to make a beam to hold up the floor below, if you like. When you have an application when they're repeated, for example, if you're doing 20 houses or 30 houses, I can see SIPS panels are fantastic. For bigger buildings where you're dealing with big span roofs, they're fantastic. By changing the roof construction in a library, which a friend of mine did, they saved 21 years of operational carbon by going from steel to SIPS. So that was an extraordinary saving. So SIPS panels are fantastic, but in domestic buildings, you rarely see the economies of scale.
Just rewinding a little bit, when you were talking about the timber frames and how constructing it on site without going through a factory, how would you be doing that? Would you just be cutting it up manually on a day as you go? Sorry, I just couldn't picture how.
Yeah. Good question. Well, timber frames are quite simple things. I mean, there are two types of timber frames, really. One is a post and beam frame, where you have big posts and big beams, and then you make a frame on the ground, effectively, and then you lift it into place. And I've done that quite a lot. There are also a kind of balloon frame, a lightweight skinned frame, where you have studs that are then sheathed in another material to give them a kind of rigidity. And actually, you start at the bottom again. You have if you want to make an in situ panel frame, you can. You put a sole plate and then you put your studs up, and then a wall plate, and really it's as simple as that. I mean, they're pieces of timber that people can handle very easily. They're lightweight things. So timber frames are very low-tech things. They're bits of 89 by 38 or 50 by 100 or 150 by 50 bits of timber. And I have to say, probably in 20 years of doing this, I've almost never had an off-site timber frame manufactured, except for the most bespoke one-off post and beam type frames that are oak or, larch or very particular thing made by craftsmen in their yard. For stud frames, I have never had one made off-site. And I've always wanted to. I haven't resisted it. It's just, for me, I've never found the economies. And when you design a project and you put it to the market, you take what the market gives you. And this is contractors telling me that it's no cheaper to make it in a factory. So last week I went up to the Midlands, to Leicester, to meet a big volume house builder to look at doing some work with them. And these people are hugely efficient in terms of their construction. Their construction method is highly evolved. We may not like what they build, and I don't particularly like what they build, but their method of construction is engineered down to a T. And they don't make timber frames in factories. They make the components, they make the studs, they make the doors, they make all of the beams and bits and pieces that they need, but they'll always make things on site because they're not paying the overheads of the factory. They're not paying the heating, they're not paying the rent, basically.
I think that's the first time I've almost heard something semi-positive about houses that are mass-produced, yes. If we can find a glimmer of light in there. Going back to Aaron's question initially, he was saying about to reach the Passive House standard. Yeah. So can you reach, I think the answer to this is yes, but can you reach the Passive House standard with any construction method?
Yes, there are masonry passive houses, and of course there are lots of timber passive houses. So they're heavyweight and lightweight, absolutely, with all methods of construction. Remember that passive houses don't depend on thermal mass. All they're interested in is building performance and energy use, really. That's the kind of core of it. And it doesn't matter which constructional system you use as long as you achieve those things. And both systems, they're achievable. It's just more complicated, I think, or harder, because it depends on, ultimately, we're talking about skill and craft and technique and craftsmanship. Those are the things that allow you really to achieve a good standard of fit, which is what a passive house is all about. And that's harder to achieve with a masonry building.
If we look at things like straw bale construction, is that another building system? How many are there?
Yeah, good question. Straw bales are nice. They're low-tech, they're available, they're cheap. They're relatively inefficient because they're big, they're not particularly good insulators. A 600 mil, thick straw bale is the same as about 150 mil of rock wool or standard insulation. Usually they're a labour of love. People use them because they want to use them. And again, none of this is just about efficiency. Remember, a building is about a labour of love, and it's about eccentricity and experimentation. So I'd applaud the use of straw bales if people wanted to use them to find out something, to discover something, or because they had a lot of them going cheap, or they wanted to use a system that they liked. I'd say if we're talking just about efficiency, I can't see a use in that sense for straw bales. But, they're beautiful, they're interesting, they're low tech. I think also within all of this, materials have provenance. They come from places. They have miles that they're traveled. They have history. They have character. And straw bales have a huge amount of character, a huge amount of personality. I love them because they don't need to travel. If you can get them from your farm next door, fantastic. I think that's brilliant. The unsaid thing in all of this is everyone thinks timber is so environmentally friendly, but usually it travels vast distances. It either comes from Scotland or it comes from Scandinavia or Canada. That's absurd for me. So I would rather use a straw bale that came from my farm next door than something that had to be mass produced in Scandinavia and shipped over and trucked down from, wherever.
And you have their word, really, that it's sustainable.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And more, I think we're facing this question. Pre-industrial revolution, materials spoke of their place. Post-industrial revolution, materials didn't speak of their place. They could come from all over. And that's something that architecture tried to encourage. There was this whole thing called the international style. Now, the big question for us is how can we use materials that tell us about our place? And straw bales can and will and do, as can timber, if you get it from a local sawmill or a local supplier.
Does the build system influence the look of the house, or is that silly because you'll just have cladding or whatever you want on the outside?
I think it doesn't need to, but I think it is invariably better when it does. I mean, I am interested in construction, and I like buildings that are talked about in terms of their method of construction. And there are some architects I admire very much, like Ted Cullinan, who can only describe a building in terms of the method of its construction. So if you sat down with Ted and he drew you any of his buildings, he would describe them in terms of the process of construction. And I think that certainly the buildings that I've done, I'd like to think that the constructional system was visible and legible. So my own house, that's a very crude, simple timber frame. There's a legibility in terms of what's in tension, what's in compression, what's doing the sheathing, the bracing, all of those sorts of things. And I really like to think that buildings are immeasurably better from those things being legible. And I think one of the things that's so sort of sanitized about our current method of construction, and lightweight timber frame is in that camp, is that you don't see the method of construction. It's all this sanitized stuff that sits behind beige plasterboard, basically.
I know that we haven't mentioned, we mentioned steel briefly. I'm going to go back to the original question and just have a quick look through. He said SIPs, masonry, ICF. I think we've talked about all of these things, timber frame, but steel frame. Is that more when you're talking about bigger buildings, we're houses here, unless it's something epic?
Sure. Well, with houses, good question. I mean, masonry buildings usually need some steel, either ridge beams or lintels or something. So usually, and actually, I mean, going back to my thing about concrete, I slightly tongue-in-cheek said concrete had a low carbon a low
backtracking now.
No, because that's the myth in a way that's fed you by the concrete industry. And strictly in terms of the science of substituting concrete for steel, it's kind of right. The problem with concrete is not the pound for pound carbon emission or the ton for ton carbon emission. It's the amount of it that's used. It's used so much, and that's the problem. The problem with masonry buildings is that, I actually think that concrete block is quite an ugly material. There's a beautiful kind of precision with timber. But a masonry building with loose steels has to be covered up. There's no beauty in that construction. You have to cover it up because it fits so badly. You have to put a layer on the top of it that allows you to keep the air in and the air out. But steel frame in domestic buildings is usually, again, not terribly efficient because you don't have the spans that necessitate a steel frame. Even if you're dealing with little steel studs, it's much less ubiquitous than timber manufacturers. So you pay a premium to get people who know how to work steel. And again, I've hardly done a steel-framed house. I don't think I have done a steel-framed house. I've done a house with bits of steel in, but I haven't done an entire steel-framed house because there's never been the need. It's never the market has never let me do it. It's always been too expensive, and and so on.
Probably should have thrown this question in a little bit earlier, but at what stage do we need to finalise which route we're going down?
Again, good question. I think when you're starting out and you're young, you think that design is an iterative process, and you do one thing and it leads to another thing and leads to another thing and leads to another thing. And you think about design in the abstract, and you get a scheme, and then you think, how am I going to build it? Now, as you get older, certainly for me, I feel right at day one, you think about how am I going to make this thing? What is the character of this building? What are we talking about? Is it steel? Is it concrete? Is it masonry? Is it brick? Is it timber? And if it's timber, what type of timber is it? And I think right at the beginning, projects are immeasurably better if we think about how could we make this, And I think design is a web where you explore all sorts of things, and you gradually hone in with increasing certainty on one thing. And for me, right at the beginning, you're considering, I could make this out of all sorts of things, but what is this? Because, remember that buildings that speak of their construction, including masonry, let's talk about masonry at its best, is a beautiful thing. So load-bearing buildings with hugely thick walls and small openings, in hot countries or cold countries, are beautiful, beautiful things. And they speak of their construction in much the same way that a timber building with posts and beams and trusses speaks of its construction. So in the abstract, I like all ways of building buildings. The question is, what is the most appropriate? And what gives this architecture, this scheme, this building, its character? And right at the beginning, I think that you need to be considering the materials. And again, what's interesting is that is something that the modern movement tried to banish, because the whole legacy of modern architecture since 1930 is that buildings were made out of kind of modern materials that were covered up, and they had no presence in the kind of legibility of the building. And we're just talking about raw space, and generally it was painted white. And I think those days are gone. I think everyone now is interested in construction, and it's called building tectonics. They're exciting, beautiful things.
As we just round off this segment, is there anything else that we should bear in mind? I feel like we've certainly talked about the different systems, but is there anything I've overlooked?
Well, I mean, I think efficiency is a big deal. I don't mean in terms of cost or even program in terms of how long things take, but there's a joy in using materials wisely and intelligently and sensibly. And that's part of the conversation that you need to be having when you're designing something is, how do I make this thing? How do I use this material intelligently and well? And how do I not use it in a wasteful way or in an inappropriate way? And all the way through a project, those are the things you need to be balancing with. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Where does the light come in? All those sorts of things. So construction is incredibly interesting. And I think most people in a way don't realize how interesting construction is. It's a beautiful, amazing language to make things with. I mean, look at the cathedrals or, our best modern buildings. I mean, they're amazing, amazing things, really. So remember, of course, that when you're designing a house, it's a big deal. You don't know what you haven't built or designed a house before. It's a minefield. And I think the best thing you can do is get a simple bit of design advice right at the beginning that'll help you navigate some of these things, because otherwise, how do you make decisions if you haven't done it before? And if I was to give one bit of advice, it would be to keep it simple. There are all sorts of ways of doing things, and your head would explode if you explored all those things. And initially, I would choose one system until it didn't work. And I think I would say that timber is the best system to use, and I can't think of a single drawback other than the fact it has no thermal mass. It's quick, it's efficient, it's cheap, it's available everywhere, it's ubiquitous, anyone can use it, anyone can do it, and it doesn't harm the environment if you choose it wisely.
Well, just as we finish up, a complete change of tack here, and I know a lot of the TV work that you do is on quite budget property, which is interesting to us and particularly to me, as I don't have a massive budget. But have you learnt a lot in your time of doing this show? Any nuggets of information you could throw our way?
Well, I suppose I have. I learnt a great deal. I mean, the contributors are fantastic. And in a way, as an architect, you're divorced from this whole world of people trying to build a house on a budget, because as an architect, you're so used to trying to make the process efficient, and if people use you as an architect, you manage this whole process. And what I discovered, really, is that there's a world which is an absolute minefield of people not knowing how to go about the process of entering this world of design, architecture, construction, building. And it is a minefield. And it's a kind of terrifying minefield. In a way, it made me feel a bit sad that there isn't a clear and easy route into the construction of your own house here. The thing that you need really early on is someone to guide you through that minefield. And that's one of the things I'm most interested in, which is then this process of how you build your house should determine what you build. So, for example, if you don't have any experience and you want to build it yourself, that will mean that you build a different building than somebody who is very experienced. So how you build it in terms of your own experience, the process you use to build it, whether you use an architect or not, a main contractor or not, will affect how you do it. And what interests me is some buildings that have been built by low-skilled, first-time self-builders, which are extraordinary. And what's great is that the architect has set them up and then left them. Set them up with a system that allows them to build an extraordinary building using the skills they have. And they benefit from the low skill. The buildings are nicer because there's bad blockwork stairs and there's timber frame construction that they've, learnt on the job. And it has their own character and personality in it. But the other things I've learnt are, again, I mean, just how hard it is to realise your own kind of bricks and mortar, your own roof over your head if you're starting out in this country. And I think the biggest crisis of our lifetime, the biggest humanitarian crisis, is that the bulk of this country now find it incredibly hard to aspire to owning, if you're young, to aspire to owning a roof over your head. And I think it's a big problem.
That's Piers Taylor from the Invisib Studio Architects. A big thank you to him. Some really interesting information to absorb. And if you want to find out more about him or his practice, check out today's show notes at houseplanninghelp.com/56. Not so much as a question for you today, more an opportunity to share experience. Particularly if you've been through a self-build project, then I'd like to know which build system you used and how was it? Was it good? Was it bad? Pros and cons? What have you learned? That would really help us all out. So houseplanninghelp.com/56. A couple of things before we finish up. Firstly, the shortlist for the UK Passive House Awards has been announced. Doubly exciting for me because I get to go and see all of these projects. My production company Regen Media producing some video inserts for the awards ceremony. So it's a great opportunity to get that physical experience of being there, seeing how people enjoy living in these houses. And I'm really looking forward to doing that for a second year. So we'll link that up in the show notes, the same session number 56. There's also a call to action. If you like what we do on the podcast, then you really should sign up to the email newsletter. It's a way of reinforcing some of the items that we've learnt. It's also inspiring too. We've got useful emails that keep you moving through the process. And it's another place to have your say. We'll tell you about who's coming up on the podcast. Also, the documentary, as that gets closer, will release more information to our email subscribers. So houseplanninghelp.com/subscribe is where you can get that. Next time, my guest is Joe Atkinson from Lilac. It's a great co-housing community in Leeds. We'll find out about it and also their funding model. So I hope you can make that one. Thanks for listening. Cheers.